Although I love seeing all your faces. All right, so are we recording now, Ayla? Okay, so check us out on our website, beyondplastics.org. That's plural, lots of good information there. And we're very happy to be co-sponsoring this webinar with our friends from the Maryland Sierra Club. Quick introduction of me. I served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in the New York Governor's Office. Before that, I worked in the environmental community. And most recently, I served as EPA Regional Administrator in EPA Region 2. Someone reminded me recently I was the longest serving Region 2 Regional Administrator. And the good thing about being a presidential appointee, I was appointed by President Obama. The good thing about having a position like that is you know when you're leaving. When the president leaves, you too are shown the door. So that gave me a fair amount of time to think about what I wanted to do next. I definitely wanted to return to environmental advocacy, and it was a question of figuring out what issue and where to do that. So after spending some time researching the issue, I decided to focus my life on working to prevent plastic pollution. And in fact, the goal of Beyond Plastics is to eliminate plastic pollution everywhere. And we're dead serious about that. We are working every day to eliminate plastic pollution everywhere. So we founded Beyond Plastics. I also teach a class at Bennington College in Vermont on plastic pollution. I think it's the first ever college level class on plastic pollution. And I decided to focus on plastics because we're turning our rivers and our oceans into landfills. About 80% of plastic in the ocean comes from litter from the land. So when you litter a plastic water bottle or a plastic bag, that somehow gets into the storm system, into rivers, into the ocean. Conservative estimates is it's about 9 million metric tons a year of plastic entering the ocean. And the statistic that really stopped me in my tracks is that scientists tell us within the next decade, for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, there will be 1 pound of plastic. And we have an opportunity to change that future if we can adopt new policies that change the way we handle plastics. Plastics is a health issue. It's a recycling issue. I'm a big supporter of recycling, but plastic has been a recycling failure. According to the EPA, only 8.5% of plastic is recycled. Plastic is a climate change issue, and it's very much an environmental justice issue. As you know, today is Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day. This is a holiday celebrating the liberation of people who were held as slaves in the United States. We're also meeting today as hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world continue to struggle with COVID-19, with spikes all over the country and all over the world. We're also meeting with the backdrop of our country reverberating from the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, and the most recent police shooting of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. These issues are all connected. If we had just relied more on science, the number of COVID deaths would have been reduced. We know that low-income communities and communities of color always carry a heavier pollution burden than more affluent communities. A recent study from the Harvard School of Public Health documented that higher levels of air pollution affects our body's ability to fight the COVID-19 virus. So plastics is very much linked to environmental justice. For one thing, we have massive amounts of impossible to recycle plastic. That means that plastic is going to landfills or garbage incinerators, almost always cited in low-income communities of color. We know that plastic is made from petrochemicals. Those manufacturing facilities are almost always in communities of color. We're now looking at a whole new fleet of ethane cracker plants. These are facilities, it's a funny name, ethane cracker, but it's a facility that uses the byproduct of fracked gas, send it by a pipeline to a new facility called an ethane cracker. The material is heated at high temperature, it cracks, and then it provides the main ingredient for single-use plastic packaging. I would encourage you to look at the situation unfolding in St. James Parish in Louisiana, where Formosa Plastics wants to expand, and they would double the amount of chemicals that they release into the air in this low-income community. So working for justice also means working for environmental justice, and there's a lot we can do. So here's the good news. Half of all plastics were ever made, were made in the past 15 years. So this is a contemporary issue that we can get a jump on. Further good news is there are alternatives to plastic. There's only so much we can do in our personal consumer choices. We need systemic change. Companies are not shifting away from plastic on their own. In fact, they're embracing more single-use plastic, especially with the price of oil dropping. It's cheaper to make. So it's clear we need laws, and that's why we're here today. We have 3 wonderful guest speakers who will inform us all on the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's House Bill 58456 and Senate Bill 3263. I want to ask you to hold your questions until after our 3 speakers have presented. And then if you want to ask a question, go to the participants bar at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see an icon that allows you to raise your hand. It's blue. And my colleague, Ayla West from Bennington College, will call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. So let me start by introducing our first speaker. We are so honored to be joined by Congressmember Alan Lowenthal. He is serving his 4th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He represents Eastern Los Angeles County and Western Orange County. He is our environmental champion in the House on the bill. He is the lead sponsor, and it's been such a pleasure to work with him and his staff. Not surprisingly, Congressmember Lowenthal was raised in Queens, where I was raised for a short period of time. He has a PhD from Ohio State University. He worked really hard to improve air quality at ports in California. Ports are a major source of diesel pollution, and he introduced a green business model, which is now being embraced by ports all over the world. In the Congress, he serves on both the House Natural Resources Committee, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And what really interests me is he is the chair of the Safe Climate Caucus in the House, which has 60 members of Congress. And Congressmember Alan Lowenthal is the chair of that important caucus. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Congressmember Alan Lowenthal, our champion on the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. Congressman, I need you to unmute yourself.
Alan, Congressman, I can see that you turned your video on, but I think you're still muted.
Am I muted now?
Nope, we can hear you.
All right,
Perfect.
let me make sure I keep this from falling over. And give me a second. I may have to use my hand to do this. All right, can you see? Now, do you need me to?
We can hear you. We can hear you perfectly. Just put the screen down a little bit because we're only seeing half of your head. Perfect.
All right, let's see how that works. First, I want to thank all of you, Judith, and everyone for joining this webinar. I hope that everybody is safe and healthy, and that also that we understand that today, June 19th, is Juneteenth, as you pointed out, Judith, a day that which was really the ending of slavery after the Civil War, when the news finally got to Texas that slavery was done. And so I want to thank you for being such a great advocate, Judith, on this issue, and for bringing the Beyond Plastics team together, for putting this webinar all together, and for your help, as you pointed out, in helping us move the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's now been more than 4 months since Senator Udall and I introduced the bill. We had a very successful rollout, tremendous amount of interest in it, and it was really due to the advocacy and the work of all the people out there who are on this webinar and yourself. But since that time, as you pointed out, we've gone through quite a few changes in this country and the Congress. We are now voting remotely. We are trying to ensure healthcare access, and that making sure that we protect people. We're working very hard on trying to get the resources to hospitals. And more recently, as we've seen, we're now pushing for major constructive reforms, police reforms, in the Justice in Policing Act of 2020, which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of, which is being led by Representative Karen Bass, my dear colleague from Los Angeles, and the Congressional Black Caucus. But the need to address these issues doesn't mean that we are not continuing to work on this legislation. Just this week, Senator Udall, I was elevating him to a higher office, which would be a great idea, but just this week, he promoted the bill in a hearing in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator Udall and I first came together on this issue more than a year and a half ago, with the idea that we would work together with advocates from the community like yourself to make sure that we would deal with the plastic waste crisis. And I'm proud that the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is the most comprehensive legislation ever introduced in Congress to tackle the plastic waste crisis. While many of us have recognized that plastic waste is a crisis, there are more and more people who are also beginning to come to grips with it, to understand it, to learn that it's not only an environmental issue, it's a public health issue, it's a climate issue, as you pointed out, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. Ultimately, it's predicted that 20% of the fossil fuel that's extracted in the world, or that we use, will be used for the production of plastics. That's how large this project is. How did I get involved in this? More than 20 years ago, I'm a professor at Cal State Long Beach, and one of my dear friends, just getting on the Long Beach City Council in the early 1990s, much more than 20 years ago, one of my dear friends who had known for many years out here was a guy called Charlie Moore, Dr. Charles Moore. And Charlie kept knocking on my door and talking to me and showing me slides and telling me what he was doing. And really, he was the founder and the executive director of the group called Algalita, which is based here in Long Beach, California. He is credited with the early discovery of the Great Pacific Garbage Gyre. This tremendously influenced my work. I began to I was then elected to the California State Legislature. I began to understand that plastics were covering the Pacific, and I began to deal with banning styrofoam packaging, limiting plastic bag pollution. It only grew when I came to Congress. I introduced legislation in 2015 about putting a fee on plastic bags. Though I really understood I wanted to do more about this issue. It was interesting. It was about a year and a half ago. I started to plan this maybe over 2 years ago. I wanted to do something special for my son's birthday. And my wife and I thought about it, and we thought, you know, the place where I'd love to go is to Antarctica on an expedition tour or expedition group by the National Geographic, which had these small kind of, one of the few ships that was allowed to land on the continent in Antarctica. And the ship was filled with scientists and naturalists. And as we were there, every day we would have daily science shows about what was happening. And many of the scientists began to show us, as they opened up many of the dead fish and birds that we saw, they were all filled with plastic. And we began to talk. Can you imagine, we are on the most remote part of this planet, and the fish that we saw in the most picturesque place. And we really went to study climate change, but what we really realized was that plastic is everywhere. It is polluting this planet. It is one of the great problems, and it was shocking to me. And so I came back really determined to do more about this. And that's when I began to talk about a year and a half ago with Senator Udall about how could we address this waste. And he also was very interested in doing something. So what we began to work on is this bill, which would incorporate best practices, common sense measures to begin to protect our communities from public health and public health from the impact of plastic pollution. We began to think about, we spend a lot of time dealing with the back end, seeing some of the impacts of plastic pollution on the planet, on the health, but we're really not dealing with the sources. Who's responsible? Many of us engage in recycling. As you pointed out, Judith, only 8% of what is recycled, what goes into recycling is ever truly recycled. The vast amount of it either ends up in the ocean, it ends up in incinerators being burned, it ends up in landfill, or until just 2 years ago, it was shipped out of this country to foreign countries, primarily China, where they used it. But they said, we don't want your waste any longer. We're not going to take it. And so what we decided to do was to do something that was not radical. What was done in many cities, states, and other countries, and that is to begin to deal with the fact of how do we stop the vast production of it? How do we change the accountability of who is really responsible for this? And that is the producers of the plastic. They must bear the responsibility of cleaning up the plastic, of funding it, of working with local cities. We must not do single-use plastics any longer. We must comprehensively begin to deal with this issue. And that's what we did. And we provided what we think is a roadmap to getting there. That's really what the legislation is. It's no means, as I pointed out, radical. But Senator Udall, even though we're going through this crisis, we have committed to addressing this waste on the Hill. And I will tell you, there's a tremendous amount of support for this. Because of the efforts of people on this webinar to call this, and which we need to keep calling, we have in my house alone over 70 co-sponsors of the legislation now. But we need people to send the word out that this is a critical issue that the Congress, you must join with others in your community who are watching this to to not only to advocate that we pass this legislation, but that you deal with issues that we are beginning to address at the national level, that you do it locally, you do it in your states, you ban certain products, you develop a state bottle deposit program, you develop extended producer liability or responsibility program. We should be doing this everywhere. This is a message that we need to deal with at every level of government. And the legislation, as I pointed out, came from my own understanding of watching what was going on in my community, came from the work of advocates like yourself. There are many, many local and state advocates who are trying to advance comprehensive positions. And Washington has pretty much ignored this crisis up until now. There has never been any kind of comprehensive legislation put forth. But I'm telling you, from now on, Congress is going to begin to deal with it. And I will also tell you, things don't happen overnight. We have to go through this process. We have to educate other members of Congress. And this will grow and grow and grow. And as I pointed out, we're dealing with issues such as climate change now. We've just introduced some major bills on climate change, and we'll continue. And you think about, as we try to eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels, the development of fossil fuels are now being shifted by the producers from energy production to plastic production. And that's a frightening thing also. And it's our job to stop that and change. As you pointed out, there are alternatives that will protect this planet. And so on behalf of those fish and those birds that I put in Antarctica filled with plastic, I thank you for what you're doing. And
thank you, Congressman. Those were very inspired words. Thanks for speaking for the fish and the ocean and the planet too. It sounds like that was an amazing journey with your family. Something great to repeat. So thank you very sincerely for your hard work. I know you've put a lot of time and effort into this, and we look forward to working with you. It's now my pleasure to introduce two of the hardest working congressional staffers in Washington, D.C. We're so fortunate to be joined by Jonathan Black, who works for Senator Udall, and Shane Trimmer, who works for Congressmember Lowenthal, who we just heard from. These two guys went through an unbelievable process putting this bill together. I've never seen anything like this. They actually had a public comment period on the bill draft, which I think every bill should have that, because we're not all Washington insiders. And so to actually get drafts of bills and then talk to staff people who are smart and engaged and have a back and forth, they met literally with hundreds of people from all different perspectives. They met with the chemical industry, the plastics industry, the fossil fuel industry, environmental advocates, and average citizens around the country who could just call them up. And they actually called you back and had really substantial conversations. So Jonathan Black is a senior policy advisor for Senator Tom Udall, who is the Senate sponsor on this bill. Senator Udall is a Democrat from New Mexico. Jonathan handles the senator's portfolio on energy and environmental matters. He is originally from Long Island. Jonathan started working for the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources in 2001 and Senator Udall in 2013. Jonathan is the point person for the senator on climate change, chemical safety, pesticides, and now his new life calling, preventing plastic pollution. And he works very closely with the wonderful Shane Trimmer. Shane is a senior legislative assistant for Congressmember Lowenthal. He previously worked in Sacramento in the California State Legislature for Assemblymember Kevin De Leon. In Congressmember Lowenthal's office, Shane is the lead person on energy, environment, science, technology issues, as well as election reform, and voting rights. The wonderful thing is we've got people from all over the country on this webinar who are anxious to hear the details of the bill and what they can do to get their own elected officials to co-sponsor and actively work in support. So I now am happy to turn the floor over to Shane Trimmer and Jonathan Black.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judith, for that introduction and the very kind words. I'm going to share my PDF right now. Hopefully that is on the screen for everybody. We're happy to kind of go into the details of what not only Judith, but also what you had heard Congressman Lowenthal bring up earlier today. Jonathan and I, this is now going into our almost sixth hour of talking about this bill on Zoom meetings today. So the great thing is you're giving us, we've had a lot of practice now for this. As Judith said, this was a very iterative process and a very deliberate process. And Jonathan's going to go a little bit more into the background later about how that process kind of took place and the process of discovery in many ways for that. This is a slide that kind of highlights so much of the broad legislative components of this legislation. By no means is this a comprehensive list, but kind of very broadly, and what we can fit in one slide, this is what it touches on. And Judith, I just wanted to correct one thing you said earlier. The House bill is 5845, and so for those of you taking notes and who we are going to insist reach out to your members of the House later on to advocate for this bill, please write that down, as well as the Senate bill number 3263. I'm going to go into a little bit more of the details of the components of this legislation. But really, we're going to start where so much of the state and the local cities had started and really paved the way in the United States to trying to tackle this issue. And so much of it was led by grassroots organizations such as a lot of the people who are here on the call and the Zoom meeting here today. And so what we did is we looked at a lot of the avenues that the states and cities had done to try to begin to tackle this process. And a lot of this took the form of bans on plastic bags and plastic single-use products. We did start with a ban on plastic carryout bags and put a 10-cent fee on all other bags at that source. And this kind of is built on previous efforts that have been seen in California. And by doing this, we incentivize the use of reusable bags. And we also ban other single-use products such as styrofoam or more technically known as expanded polystyrene, which the congressman led a bill in the state house in California about a decade ago on trying to do it at the state office there. We also put a ban or at least make it harder to be able to get access to some of these other single-use products like utensils and straws, where we make them available upon request. And so instead of you automatically just getting these straws and plastic utensils when you get takeout or a carry-out item, it would be still available to you if you needed it, but you would have to request it, and therefore making it a little bit harder to get, but available to those who actually do need these products. And really what we were trying to do here is be able to identify what the most common wasted products are that have more environmentally friendly or sustainable alternatives. We didn't want to create some ancillary environmental issues by outright banning all single-use plastics. And so we really tried to be deliberate about a targeted method about what we banned and what we made slightly less available. And so what you can see in the slide here is we, they through these beach cleanups that happen in the United States and around the world, they keep a tally of what is found in these on these beach cleanups that are found in the waste stream, would have found it's polluted. And these are single-use items. These are items that have more easily sustainable alternatives. And also what you see in the picture there is a MRF, a municipal recycling facility, that has to be stopped because the system's all gummed up with plastic bags or other materials that shouldn't really be in the recycling stream, but people put into the recycling stream. So really we tried to identify and help some of this. Also, this gets to a little bit of what both Judith and the congressman were saying about what happens when we recycle something. And just because we put something in the blue bin doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be recycled. In many ways, that might go from the blue bin directly to a landfill. If we're lucky, it's being sorted to be recycled, but it had traditionally been exported, which had actually been the case for the majority of those recycled products that we thought were being recycled. And even though here in the United States we would consider it technically recycled, when it went over to predominantly developed countries or to China, what would happen there is they would sort through it once more to get some of the products that they might be able to have some kind of recyclable material from, like plastic number 1s and 2s, but then the rest of that would then go into the waste stream there, go be landfilled there, or even worse, incinerated out there. And you can also see that approximately 15% of the material, the plastic material, was incinerated here in the country, in the United States. But what is truly recycled in terms of that 8%, breaking it even further down, the stuff that gets repurposed or recycled into a material that is a similar product, or like taking a number 1 bottle into a similar bottle, that's only about 3% or 2.5% of that what you put in the recycling bin. So sadly, when you put that bottle in the recycling bin thinking that it's turning into the products of your next plastic bottle, that was only true for about 3% of that material. So kind of thinking about that and looking at trying to inspect what the best practices were, not only here in the United States, but around the world, looking at what provinces were doing in Canada, looking at what they were trying to do in the European Union, and trying to be able to identify how we can tackle this issue more holistically and really at the source. For both Jonathan and I, something that really percolated to the top very quickly for us was this idea of producer responsibility or product stewardship. And it was clear for us at the beginning of these conversations that you can't handle plastic waste in a vacuum. So we had to deal with all material types. And so even though the bill is called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, it covers all material types that are put into the waste stream. And also it incorporates all of these material types into these extended producer responsibility organizations, or what we call PROs. And this is the industry getting together, putting together these nonprofits where we put in the legislation, we put them as the responsible party for the collection and the recycling and the financial burden of these products. Where right now they design these to be entered into the marketplace, and then that's the extent of what they have to be concerned with. And so when they are designing these products, they're designing it with the idea of how to best market these. But by putting them responsible for the end use of these products as well, not only do they have to be concerned with the design of the product to market it, but they also have to be very considerate about how recyclable these materials are and what the costs associated with those are, which will inform better decision making at their level at the front end as well. We do this also within the first decade. We require them to dramatically reinvest into the infrastructure of of these municipal MRFs, of these recycling facilities, so that we can begin to tackle this issue. And so much of this so far has been at the burden of the taxpayers. And so by putting these extended producer responsibility mechanisms in place, that end use, those decisions are now on to those companies in the industry. We attached onto the extended producer responsibility piece this national deposit system, and folks in California and in other states are used to this, these state deposit systems. In putting together this legislation, again, Jonathan and I tried to see what the best practices were, and there were a couple that really percolated to the top for us, and that one of them was Oregon. A lot of this, the bottle deposit language is something that we put together looking at Oregon as a best practice. And what you can see from this sliding scale is not only are the rates of recycling higher for these products under the system that have bottle deposits, but also the higher that fee, the more recyclable that product is. And so in the legislation, we take that 10-cent fee, that 10-cent deposit that we put onto these materials that can then be returned and collected again by the consumer. And anything that's not then returned, industry is required to reinvest those extra funds into the recycling facility to improve the collection and the ability to recycle these products.
Shane, are you on mute?
Yeah, I think so. Either I muted myself or somebody muted me. I'm sorry. That was probably on me. Also, what the legislation does is it calls for post-consumer recycled content standards for a lot of this material. Right now, some industries might have voluntary efforts that they put in place as goals to reach, but there's little more incentive than just their word that they would be able to achieve these. And so by putting in these post-consumer recycled content standards, we force industry to be able to reinvest and to re-put these materials into recyclable materials at the end use. And so this brings down the cost by creating that market for these materials, thus allowing it to be more competitive with these virgin materials. But it also requires that we start to beginning to think about using these materials for recycled content. Now we specify certain percentages for the beverage bottles, and some of this has been informed by talking with experts, but also a little bit informed by what industry has already placed on themselves to be able to accomplish. And so you can see that the first marker is we require 25% beverage bottles to be made of recycled content. Other products, because we didn't really have specific numbers that we were able to pinpoint or to be able to pull from, we pull in the EPA and NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, to be able to set these percentages for these other products. Also, so important for this legislation is creating this national standard in many ways. Right now, we have a different standard for each city, each township, on what is recycled, what is being able to be recycled. And so we define recycling and what is recyclable into the legislation. And then I think I'm going to hand it off to Jonathan here.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
We just have a few more slides and then we're going to get to questions. Another component the Congressman mentioned, we've been sending so much of our waste overseas. I think in 2019, it was something like 157,000 shipping containers to these developing countries. They can't handle this waste and it leaches into the environment. So our bill puts a ban on that. Shane, if you could advance the next slide. The congressman also discussed about this issue of new plastic facilities. The bill puts up a 3-year pause on the development of these facilities. The industry, right, before COVID happened, had announced the plans for $164 billion in investments for 264 new plastic facilities. And, these are greenhouse gas super polluters. They're discharging, you can see a picture of these little plastic pellets into our rivers and whatnot before they even become a product. So we put a pause on that for up to 3 years in our bill. Shane, if you advance to the next slide. There are a couple of other provisions. We wanted to do something on cigarette butts and electronic cigarette cartridges and fishing gear. So we have some small provisions in there, nothing grand because we weren't able to really figure out exactly how to resolve some of these issues. But we also do protect states for going above and beyond what is done in the bill. Shane, if you go to the next slide. Shane mentioned, and Judith did too, that we had a very long process, very deliberative. We took a lot of comments. I want to say thank you right now to Judith and Beyond Plastic. She was a major force to be reckoned with. She was there to MC the February 11th bill launch in February 2020 in the Capitol building. We heard from, as she mentioned, chemical industry, environmentalists, and a bunch of others. So many people really went and put some thought into this bill as we crafted it. Shane, one more. Right now, we're working on trying to move this thing forward in Congress. Every Congress is about 2 years, so we have until the end of this year for action, and then the bill would have to be reintroduced again. Hopefully, with the Biden administration and a Democratic Senate, I think we would be able to have a lot better path forward, but we're working on it at the committee level. We're trying to consider possible amendments, and of course, we're trying to have a lot of state and local work continue. Go ahead, more. Shane, I'll just mention again our bandwidth dealing with coronavirus and the racial issues that have come up right now has kind of moved a lot of issues like this one sort of to the back burner, but it's coming back now that folks are re-engaging. During this, we have seen some really disgusting stuff. I think industry sort of promoting single-use plastic as the most hygienic thing and really attacking things like our bottle deposit bills and other stuff. But this is not stuff that we think will stand. And Shane, one more thing here. So this is where we'll get into your questions, but obviously what can you do? We want you and Judith and Beyond Plastics to really support our efforts in Congress and at the national level. Write and call your members of Congress. I've seen a couple people ask about members of Congress on the chat screen, but also publicly write letters to your newspapers and make sure that you call members out by name and say, why haven't they done this? That gets into their clips, that gets more attention. And of course, just support your local action. So our last slide, which folks had asked if these slides are going to be sent around, they are. Here's our contact information. So feel free to reach out to me and Shane. I saw a couple folks from Long Island here. Judith mentioned I'm originally from Long Island. I've worked for Senator Udall and New Mexico senators for almost 20 years now, but we always enjoy hearing from everybody across the country, whether you're our state or district. And Judith, why don't we leave it to you now to figure out how you want to handle some questions. This is amazing. You've got like 200 plus folks online here. It's terrific to have that engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Shane. That was fantastic. And if we have your contact information, we will send all of you the slides, the bill. Someone asked, how do you find out if your member of Congress is already a co-sponsor? Their name will be on the first page of the bill. Also, go to the Beyond Plastics website, beyondplastics.org. We will provide regular updates on what's going on with the bill. And we're now going to have a few minutes for questions and answers. This will be tricky because we've had 211 people on this webinar. So if you have an important question, please go to the participants icon in the bottom bar, and you can click on raising your hand. and my friend and colleague Ayla West will call on people in the order of which they've raised their hand. I do see Debbie Cohen from Cafeteria Culture up first. So Debbie, would you like to pose your question to Shane or Jonathan?
Yes, I would, and thank you very much. And I don't know what Cafeteria Culture is, but so be it. But Shane and Jonathan, I know how hard you've been working on this. I've worked as a staffer on the Hill before, early in my life. Thank you. And Judith, thank you. I think a lot of us on this call have been hoping and wishing that we would get this kind of legislation out there. Two questions which I hope are widespread questions, and answer them in whatever detail you want. I'm concerned about unintended consequences. This bill puts a lot of responsibility and a lot of cost on the PROs. And I am curious.
What's a PRO?
The Producer Responsibility Organization.
Yeah,
So
okay.
There's a lot that's put on them. My concern would be what in this legislation or in your thinking or your discussions leads you to believe that these companies that are members of the PROs are not going to push the costs that we're imposing on them back onto local communities and back onto consumers, particularly as you talked initially about the environmental justice issues. So that's one broad question. And the other one, could you explain and discuss the bill sections that spur innovation and incentivize big corporations to make reusable products and items that can actually be recycled? It's in your summary. I see one provision fairly down. I think it is.
Let me jump in here, Debbie, and try and address some of these questions. And the first comment overarching is that concern about pushing the responsibility onto taxpayers and consumers. That is the situation we're living with right now. We estimate something on $10 billion per year spent from our municipalities in cleaning, collecting, sorting, moving the stuff around. That is kind of the mechanism that I think industry has really relied in this sort of age of recycling, is that it's the consumer that needs to clean it, needs to pick it up off the streets, needs to pick it off the beaches. And so we are putting these producer responsibility organizations in charge. And we do expect that the price of cleaning it up would be baked into those products. And so consumers might see that too, but we want to be offsetting the price of, our tax dollars that are going to those failing programs so that they can be freed up to be spent on other programs that are really important. Obviously, we can probably all name a whole lot of them right now. But they will have very specific targets to meet that are in the bill. I can't rattle them off right now, for collection and recycling and reusability and things that need to be met. So they have to meet those, and the EPA would oversee that. And there isn't exactly a section in the bill that talks about necessarily the incentives, because we're not giving tax incentives for better sustainable products and things like that. But those targets need to drive those companies to be much more sustainable in the types of things that they're putting out. And so I think that that's what drives those types of incentives, is to be able to meet those goals.
Thank you.
And I'll just add with the idea of the PROs and the way we designed it the way we did is, EPR is a sliding scale. You can have one that's very government focused, very government run, where they are doing all the recycling and the collection, and they just give these companies a receipt at the end of, a time period. But, for us, what we were trying to design was something that we saw as not only maybe a little bit more politically viable, but also something that was designed based on what we had seen and heard from people on the ground who are participating in these current extended producer responsibility mechanisms in other countries or other provinces. And what we heard from environmental NGOs as well as from industry is that the model that we began to frame this off of was more in line of what they had seen as was more successful on the ground.
Thanks. So we're now going to have a question from Osahan Ohega. You have to.
Hi. Hi. Thank you. You got my name perfect. Thank you. The question for me, the question that I have is, what are you guys going to do, I guess, in terms of supporting organizations that are working on solutions for plastics contamination, or just working on biodegradable alternatives? I am the founder of an organization that is working on developing a synthetic fiber that is, well, developing an alternative to synthetic fibers that are used in the hair industry. And we're working with plants, and it's hard to find funding out there. And I want to know if there's any way that, you know, some type of support could be included in the bill for organizations that are, you know, working on this type of science. Thank you.
What's the name of your organization?
It's called Aja Labs. We're a biotech. We have 4 scientists working on this.
Right.
And we're really excited.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I used to work at the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, when it used to actually enforce environmental laws. And within EPA, there's an Office of Research and Development, and they do have a grant program for innovative green technologies. There's a business in the Albany, New York area called Ecovative Design. Everyone should check them out. They make an alternative to polystyrene from agricultural waste. And they got a big financial boost when they started 10 years ago by getting an EPA grant, not a loan, a grant. So I'm not sure that that program still exists. I hope it does. And feel free to contact Beyond Plastics, and I'm happy to brainstorm a little bit with you on that. John, Shane, did you want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add. Our bill doesn't specifically fund that type of stuff. I think I'd be very interested to learn some more. We'd love to think about ways in which to support those types of efforts. But yeah, it's not encapsulated in the bill. Judith, I know you've got a process here, but I see a couple of questions in the chat. Let me just respond quickly. Someone asked, how would this be enforced? And you said you used to work for EPA. So the EPA would be enforcing these rules, these targets and things like that. And hopefully that would drive, you know, much more interest in these companies like the one that you're talking about. So.
Great. Ayla, A-Y-L-A.
Hi, yes, that's me.
Great.
My question is just in regards to making, with this bill, the plastic-free lifestyle a little bit more accessible. Like, what would be in this bill and what has been thought of to make that plastic-free systemic change intersectional and accessible to all? Kind of to clarify, for instance, taking the situation now with COVID-19, more and more single-use plastics are being utilized and even promoted for safety measures. Most grocery stores in my area aren't allowing shoppers to use reusable bags, things like that. And in addition, individuals with disabilities who require, for instance, a plastic bendy straw to drink and participate in normal mealtime functions. So if there's anything in the bill that has thought of circumstances like that before completely eliminating these products from the public.
I think I understand the question, but feel free to follow up if I don't, for whatever reason, answer it. You know, and I think I touched on it a little bit. Is, you know, by no means do we want to create some kind of other environmental issue by banning something that is, for whatever reason, the best tool for the job, and it's made entirely of plastic. But, you know, so things like cutlery utensils and straws, we kind of consulted quite a bit with many organizations within the disability community to make sure that we can get this to a place. And some organizations got to a place that they really liked what we did, where we didn't ban these straws and utensils, but just made them available upon request. but we're still having those conversations. And so we don't by any means want to bar somebody to be able to have the accessibility needs that they have. And so I think we were trying to reach that happy medium.
Yeah, I'll jump in and talk too, because there's some comments in the group chat that kind of tail on this, about the consumer's responsibility and access to these things. And I think that's why our bill really takes a look sort of at the front end, at the producers and the companies that are making the products that are marketed to consumers. You know, as a consumer, we can only really do so much when we are bombarded with so much material that, you know, we can't necessarily handle it. And so it's, you know, I do my best to kind of live a plastic-free or plastic-less lifestyle, but, you know, it really is incumbent upon producers and marketers of these products to incorporate these necessary sustainable ideas into their packaging and marketing and offer us things that can be used. And I think, you know, Shane had a great comment earlier on a different thing that we're doing is that, you know, right now it's the marketers that are designing a package that's sending it out, and it's flashing and it's designed to catch your eye and to be bought and to be used. You know, we need those companies to have people in there that are taking into account about how it's going to be collected, reused, recycled, and returned on the back end, because without that, these marketers are putting out something flashy. It's got so many different components. It's got a shrink sleeve. So each piece may be technically recyclable in a lab, but if you put it in your blue bin and it gets shipped off someplace, nobody's going to be able to recycle it, and it's just going to get incinerated or turned into fuel or go into pollution. And so that's where we're really trying to focus, is like, this is, I commend you and myself and everybody for trying to reduce plastic as much as we can. And I know Judith carries around beeswax, you know, covering her utensils that she uses, and that's terrific. But, you know, all of us on this call can do that, and we still, you know, really need something really more significant. And fortunately, the solution is not so complicated. It's for these companies to make less of it. It's a very simple solution.
Mm-hmm. Great. So thanks, Jonathan. We have time for 2 more questions. And then I just want to remind people, type in your name in the chat box and your contact information if you haven't. You should have received a summary of the bill and the actual bill in advance. If not, we will resend all of that, including the slides that were presented today. You all have a homework assignment. You didn't know you were going to get one, but we want you to look at the front of the bill in the House and the Senate. Look and see if your own elected representatives have signed on as co-sponsors. If not, please contact them and urge them to co-sponsor and actively support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I know you're inspired by this discussion, so 3 movies for you to watch when you're ready: The Story of Plastic, Microplastic Madness, and also the PBS Frontline special on pbs.org called Plastic Wars. We will keep updates on our website, beyondplastics.org. I would not be doing my job if I did not also make a shameless pitch for donations. If you are so inclined, go to the Beyond Plastics website and make a very generous donation so we can keep doing this kind of work. And I'm now happy to call on Candace L. with a question. And we'll get through just a few more questions, so I just want to urge everyone to keep your questions brief and the responses brief. Do we have Candace?
Yeah, I typed my question in the chat box, but I guess I can just address it. So I think my biggest concern with the bill is that passing the responsibility to consumer by charging the consumer fees for their bags, is I feel like it sent a wrong incentive to people, because most people don't know the problem lies on production. And I think there must be a better way to not passing the responsibility, because I think that one bill, like, or that one section of the bill, really send a wrong message or incentive. And my second question is, how did the legislation gonna ease the production of plastic from the oil and chemistry packaging companies?
Great, thanks, Candace. Those are two big questions. Shane, Jonathan, you want to quickly respond?
Yeah, thanks, Candace. We had a little bit of your conversation in the chat room, and I just have to kind of disagree a little bit that I think it's the incentive that we're trying to send to the consumers not to use that bag and to use reusable bags. And so, number one, we eliminate single-use plastic bags outright. But those other carryout bags that are replacing them, they would have that charge of 10 cents. And some of that would go to the merchant, and other piece of that would go to the government for a fund to help low-income communities have access to reusable items like reusable bags. And so we feel like that's an incentive to keep folks away from using disposable items. And I understand your concern about the impacts to low-income folks, but we think that we're trying to address that as best we can. In terms of the plastic producers, the part of our bill at the end, it puts a pause on these facilities because there's so many planned to be built right now. And we want to make sure that they have up-to-date regulations and thought through all this stuff before we actually build these facilities.
Thanks, Jonathan. A question now from John Zelazny.
Sorry, may I just ask, so is the charge from the plastic bag not gonna go back to the producer of the plastic bags?
So no more plastic bags. The bill eliminates the ability to use plastic bags. If you go to a store and you take a paper bag or some other carryout bag that's a disposable, that would be 10 cents to the merchant. And then the merchant would keep some of that, especially if they promote discounts for bringing your own reusable items. When I go to the store, I bring my reusable items, and I actually get an incentive for doing that, and they discount some of my stuff. So that's how it happened.
Thank you.
Answer the question, Candace?
Oh, thank you.
Great, good questions, thanks. John Zelazny, please.
Yes, I had a question. The bill has a recycled content component to it. How do you guarantee that that recycled content is actually from recycled feedstock and not just filled in with more cheap plastic, virgin plastic?
I think the bill says post-consumer. So
well, what mechanism is there to guarantee that it's post-consumer?
There's some transparency requirements within the extended producer responsibility organizations themselves, and then the Environmental Protection Agency is charged with the oversight of it. And so even though I do think that we give quite a bit of freedom for the industry to be able to put these processes together themselves, we thought it was still going to be important for the EPA and the federal government to some extent be involved as the oversight function. I would say that that's probably the safeguard to allow to account for that.
The reason I ask is because, I mean, if we're only recycling, at best like 13% of all plastic, where do you get the 80%? Yeah, where do you get the 80%? In year 10.
Well, 80% is far out there, and if you look at sort of the staggering, we've put out recycle and collection targets that are supposed to ramp up over that time. So, I think we're starting lower and building and building and building over time. So hopefully that will become. But we do have some folks, as Shane says, for transparency, but also reevaluating and making sure that these things are possible. We don't want to allow folks to pretend to add recycled content.
Okay, so this is the lightning round. We're going to keep doing a few more questions, but they have to be quick questions and quick answers. Patty McGrath, you're up. You have to unmute.
Okay, yes, thank you. Does this apply to synthetic turf fields? Will this bill affect the installation of toxic synthetic turf fields?
we were trying to get to the consumer goods side of it. And so in terms of the where the environmental justice component of it gets to, I would say that probably not in terms, because it's not the consumer goods side, but there are, a number of things that are very important to address in this about the broader issues that we just from a bandwidth issue weren't able to incorporate into the legislation.
That's fair, fair.
Okay, got it. Not in the bill. Next question, Guy Jacob. Guy, you have to go on mute. Unmute.
The plethora of information in the slides, if you could also send that via email or on your website so we could, use it, copy the information so we could use it to go after our elected officials and first to share it with our respective organizations. Wondering whether or not you are actively pursuing Republicans to co-sponsor this legislation. With some other legislation in the past, I was very surprised to find out that because certain organizations were trying to encourage Republicans to co-sponsor the bill, they were actually hiding some of the Democrats who had already co-sponsored the bill from the government website. And you could go and you could check and you'd see if your elected official is there. Elected official is not there, but he or she had already co-signed it, but it was hidden. So not to discourage Republicans from signing on, not to show so many Democrats. I don't know.
Thanks, Guy.
What your strategy is for getting Republicans, if any strategy at all, on this bill.
Yeah, we would definitely love to have Republicans. We're unfortunately supported only by Democrats right now, but there are a number of states like Maine and others that are following a lot of these policies. And, Iowa has a bottle deposit program and whatnot. So we're really doing hard to do that. But we need the advocates, frankly, pushing members for these types of things. So we'll do it on our end. You guys have to do on your end too.
So
in other
words, you have no plans to hide Democrats from the government website.
No.
Okay.
No one is hidden. This is a bipartisan effort. You get extra points if you find a Republican co-sponsor. We want Republicans, Democrats, Tea Party, Green Tea Party, anyone you can get. We want on the bill if they're committed to reducing plastic pollution.
Let me make a real quick point. I know you're trying to get through lightning round, but Guy, recycling and plastic pollution, unlike things like climate change, it has a lot of bipartisan interests. Climate change, we have Democrats versus Republicans, quite frankly, very divisively. But Republicans, Democrats all want to do something on plastic pollution. Unfortunately, industry is promoting a lot of false solutions, continuing us down the line of recycling or federal investment in recycling infrastructure or just education for consumers, just sort of saying like, that's what we need to solve the problem. They're also kind of outsourcing the blame on these developing countries, saying it's Southeast Asia that's responsible for all the ocean waste. So you'll see a lot of bipartisan proposals in Congress with Democrats and Republicans supporting recycling, but we need to do better also educating our Democrats that that is not necessarily the way to go. We need much more aggressive and ambitious proposals like the ones we proposed.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Next question is from Mary Hunt.
Wait, Judith, can I just jump in really quickly? We have C. Shen above Marion Hunt.
Oh, I'm very sorry. C. Shen. My mistake.
No worries. Hey, everyone. I'm C. Shen, and I work for UCLA Law. I'm a legal fellow at the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. My question is pretty brief, and it's very specific about landfills. So what is your perspective on those well-managed, landfills? Do you think this is a good end life for those plastic products, or you think those are, you have other concerns of those well-managed landfills? Thank you.
I think we want to do everything possible not to send plastic to either well-managed or poorly managed landfills. The goal is to reduce the production and use of plastic.
Why can't my question?
Marion Hunt, you're up next.
Oh, this is great. I'm very excited about this, and I want to help and work on it. When I was working on legislation on these things a few years ago, we found that the trade associations, the American Beverage Association, was one of the biggest hurdles. And you said you were bringing in stakeholders. Have you brought in them? Are you talking to them at all?
Yes, a lot, always. It's from the beginning and continuing until yesterday, most recently, actually.
Yeah, there's huge stakeholders, huge trade associations, and I think what our goal really, not to lay any whatever on trade associations, is to really, and you can help with this too, not only members of Congress, but specific companies, putting the pressure on these specific companies, and we can start peeling them off and getting them, to the table to stand up and agree to, federal engagement and involvement on this, because, trade groups, it's the least common denominator. They have a number of different companies that have different varying views, and they're trying to deal with them. The American Beverage Association, they're definitely very engaged on this. We've had a number of conversations with them, the American Chemistry Council, and so they represent a whole bunch of members, but we're also talking to their member companies directly and folks that really do want to be ahead of where some of these company associations are.
Yeah, it is long overdue for us to get a national bottle bill. And the American Beverage Association can play a role, even if they would just be neutral, that would be good. And I think in our post-COVID world, well, it's not post-COVID, we're still struggling with COVID, budgets for local governments is going to be so tight. You're looking at major local government budget cuts. And so recycling programs will be stressed. We know that there's a significantly higher recycling rate on beverage containers when they're part of a container deposit program, as opposed to when you just put things in your blue bin. So my sense is American Beverage Association would do a tremendous public service by no longer opposing bottle bills. They're the most effective example of extended producer responsibility, and they reduce litter and create jobs. So that's a really good one to focus on. Thanks, Marion. We'll go to Marguerite.
Teachers at the College of St. Rose, Sister Marguerite Donovan, calling to congratulate you on the stupendous work you are doing, on the wonderful team you have surrounded yourself with, and a comment. Congratulations on this initiative. I see it as a great beginning. I see the problem in three parts. And the only successful way to turn plastics down is to shut off the supply of the raw materials, namely oil. That's not an overnight, that's a long-term project. But I see the bill currently under discussion as focusing heavily on the consumer. Consumers are being incentivized to recycle, but then there's no market for recycle. And then there's the middle part where we need good entrepreneurship to come in and invest in the recycling operation, because it's not going to be 20 years before this monster goes away. And then there is the incentive to the producers to turn off the spigots of oil and find renewable sources. It will answer a load of questions. But congratulations to all of you. And I'm so happy that I got on the line to say that to you, Judy. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, sister. It's wonderful to see you. Now you all know why I am the way I am, because I had wonderful nuns teaching college, like Sister Marguerite. All your points are spot on. No argument from us. Let's go to Kristen Casio.
Hi, thank you. I'm a caller from the Buffalo area. I had the pleasure of hearing you speak at an investigative post event maybe a year or two back, and was very impressed by you then, and am excited about your work now. My question is about this particular bill and then about the work of Beyond Plastics in general. I'm not sure, again, this is my introduction to this bill here today, but as part of getting Beyond Plastics, it's just everywhere, as we all know. And the question that always comes to my mind is, what do we replace it with? Which leads to the question of solutions. Alternative products, more innovative methods. So I was wondering if there's anything in this bill that does talk about incentivizing innovation, either from the large corporations or for startups, or is there any mechanism beyond on the punitive banning side that speaks to sort of funding and incentivizing better practices?
Let me jump in, Kristen. Thanks for your question. The producer responsibility is the mechanism by which we are trying to create these incentives for the companies and the producers and the product makers to use the most sustainable packaging and products there is. And so by having the responsibility of dealing with your product on the back end, the collection, the sortation, the recycling, the reusing of it, you can have these companies innovate and design packaging and products that are much better and sustainable for the environment. We don't have direct, tax incentives or things like that. We've thought about that, but again, we think that, this is sort of an environmental principle going back for many, many years, is the polluter pays. You try and bake into your product or your issue, the cost of its cleanup. And so when you start doing that, you have the incentive for saving money and having a product that is less polluting and less unsustainable.
Thanks, Jonathan. We'll now go to the very effective environmental attorney, Carol Richmond.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you all for getting this bill out. I'm just curious, I think I know the answer, but have you considered having a phase out on certain types of plastic packaging? For instance, you can buy a package that has, 1 inch of goods wrapped in a foot of plastic so that it's not, won't be stolen in a store. That's the kind of thing that could be looked at and perhaps banned. I think in the past decade, we've watched how you can go to the grocery store and buy vegetables and take them out, and now everything is prepackaged. And, salad clamshells, everything. Is there a way to simply start banning certain types of goods? Or I should say certain types of goods being packaged.
I think that there is a way to do that. I think that what you saw and what I had mentioned earlier was the effort to really try to identify the ones that are found most recently to be in the waste stream and to start with those. And then I think that we do try to disincentivize that in many ways, but through the EPR mechanism, because that's just going to be that's just going to be an additional cost onto these producers on the back end for them to have all this material on the front end. I think that I think we do want to, by having the EPR decisions being made and by these marketing decisions being made by the last best chooser of these, they will then have the incentive to design and to put these products in the marketplace that are requiring them to think more about the back end. So I think we try to incentivize it that way. I think that some of the things that you had said about these additional materials, I think that's kind of getting toward a little bit of maybe a next step in the process, in the banning process, as we see these bans and this EPR mechanism going into effect. How is it not, how can we still tweak this? And I think that, it just didn't make sense for us to do it in this bill at this time.
Thank you, Shane. And I might also add that, this is a comprehensive, big national bill that I am over the moon excited about. But we also know that we get this big systemic change when laws come from the bottom up. So there is an opportunity to work on some of these principles at the local and state level. So on the website of Beyond Plastics, we had drafted a model local law. It's called the Plastic Trifecta, and it bans polystyrene foam. It has plastic straws only upon request. It bans plastic bags and puts a fee on paper bags. Now, in some communities, a lot of that is already in place, even though things are delayed. In other communities around the country, there's none of that. So what I urge people to do is look at that model bill, and then you can even pick parts of it, go to your city council, go to your county legislature, and try to get it adopted. It will help your own community, but it also builds the pressure, because then a lot of the industry groups say that they don't want the dreaded patchwork quilt. And then it's time for national action. So, so that's a way to approach it. I'm afraid we need to wrap up. It's now 7 p.m. You all have been so riveted by this. We went a half hour later. No, it's only 2:30. Thank you for your attention. Shane, please thank Congressmember Lowenthal. And if we could all give a round of applause to Jonathan Black and Shane Trimmer. Thank you so much. You two are working so hard, and we are so grateful. You're exactly what public servants are supposed to be doing in our nation's capital. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you on the next Zoom. Take care.
Thank you all again, and thank you, Judith, for all that you do and Beyond Plastics does. It's so great. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Support Judith's work, everybody, and help us get this bill passed.
Indeed.